Then the voice of the Lord came to me, saying, "This is the beginning of the enemy's last-day army. This is Satan's ultimate deception. His ultimate power of destruction is released when he uses Christians to attack one another. Throughout the ages, he has used this army, but never has he been able to use so many for his evil purposes as he is now. Do not fear. I have an army too. You must now stand and fight, because there is no longer any place to hide from this war. You must fight for my kingdom, for truth, and for those who have been deceived." This word from the Lord was so encouraging that I immediately began yelling to the Christian prisoners that they were being deceived, thinking that they would listen to me. When I did this, it seemed that the whole army turned and looked at me. The cloud of fear and deception that was over them started to come towards me. The battle begins. Then I turned and saw the army of the Lord standing behind me. There were thousands of soldiers, but they were still greatly outnumbered. I was shocked and disheartened, for it seemed that there were actually many more Christians being used by the evil one than there were in the army of the Lord. I also knew that the battle about to begin was going to be viewed as the great Christian Civil War, because very few understood the dark powers that were behind the impending conflict. As I looked more closely at the army of the Lord, the situation seemed even more discouraging. Only a small number were fully dressed in their armor. Many only had 1 or 2 pieces of armor on. Some did not have any at all. A large number were already wounded. Most of those who had on all their armor still had very small shields, which I knew would not protect them from the onslaught that was coming. Very few of those who were fully armed were adequately trained to use their weapons. To my surprise, the great majority of these soldiers were women and children. Behind this army was a trailing mob, which seemed very different in nature from the prisoners who followed the evil horde. Those in the mob seemed overly happy, as if intoxicated. They were playing games, singing songs, feasting, and roaming about from one little camp to the next. This reminded me of Woodstock. I ran toward the army of the Lord to escape the onslaught I knew would be coming at me from the evil horde. In every way, it seemed that we were in for a most one-sided slaughter. I was especially concerned for the mob that was trailing the Lord's army. So I tried to raise my voice above the clamor to warn them that a battle was about to begin. Only a few could even hear me. Those who heard me gave me the peace sign and said that they did not believe in war. When those in the mob assured me that the Lord would not let anything bad happen to them, I tried to explain that he had given us armor because we needed it for what was about to take place. To this they retorted that they had come to a place of peace and joy where nothing like that could ever happen to them. I began praying earnestly for the Lord to increase the shields of those with armor, to help protect those who were not ready for the battle. Then a messenger came up to me, gave me a trumpet, and told me to blow it quickly. When I did, those who had at least some of their armor on immediately responded, snapping to attention. More armor was brought to them, which they quickly put on. I noticed that those who were wounded did not put armor over their wounds. But before I could say anything about this, enemy arrows began raining down on us. Everyone who did not have on all their armor was wounded. Those who had not covered their wounds were struck again in the same area that they had been wounded in before. Those who were hit by arrows of slander immediately began to slander those who were not wounded. Those who were hit with gossip began to gossip. And soon a major division had been created within our own camp. I felt that we were on the verge of destroying ourselves, just as some of the heathen armies in Scripture had done by rising up to kill each other. The feeling of helplessness was terrible. The vultures appeared. Then, vultures swooped down to pick up the wounded and deliver them into the camp of prisoners. The wounded still had swords and could have easily struck down the vultures, but they didn't. They were actually carried off willingly because they were so angry at those who were not wounded like they were. I quickly thought about the mob behind the army and ran to see what happened to them. It seemed impossible, but the scene among them was even worse. Thousands lay on the ground, wounded and groaning. The sky over them was darkened by the vultures that were carrying them off to become prisoners of the enemy. Many of those who were not wounded just sat in a stupor of unbelief. They too were easily carried away by the vultures. Even though a few had begun trying to fight off the vultures, since they did not have the proper weapons, the vultures did not even pay them any attention. The wounded were so angry, they would threaten and drive away anyone who tried to help them. But they became docile and submissive to the vultures. Those who had not been wounded soon gave up trying to fight off the vultures and began running from the scene of battle. This first encounter with the enemy was so devastating that I was tempted to join them in their flight. Then, incredibly fast, some of those who had fled began reappearing with full suits of armor on, holding large shields. This was the first bit of encouragement that I remember seeing. These warriors who were returning no longer had the mirth of the party, but an awesome resolve had now replaced it. I knew that although these had been deceived once, they would not be so easily deceived again. They began to take the place of those who had fallen, and even began forming new ranks to protect the rear and flanks. This caused such great courage to spread throughout the army that the determination of everyone to stand and fight again began to rise. 3 great angels named Faith, Hope, and Love immediately came down and stood behind the army. As we looked at them, all of our shields began to grow. It was amazing how quickly despair had turned to faith. It was a solid faith, too, tempered by experience. The highway. Now everyone had swords named the Word of God, and arrows named for different biblical truths. We wanted to shoot back, but we did not know how to avoid hitting the Christians who were being ridden by the demons. Then it occurred to us that if these Christians were hit with truth, they would wake up and fight off their oppressors. So I fired off a few arrows, as did some of the others. Almost all of the arrows hit Christians. However, when the arrow of truth went into them, they did not wake up or fall down wounded. They became enraged, and the demon riding on them grew much larger. This shocked everyone, and we began to feel that this was an impossible battle to win. Even so, with faith, hope, and love, we were confident that we could at least hold our own ground. Another great angel named Wisdom then appeared and directed us to fight from the mountain behind us. On the mountain were ledges at different levels for as high as we could see. At each higher level, the ledges became narrower and more difficult to stand on. Each level was named for a biblical truth. The lower levels were named for foundational truths, such as salvation, sanctification, prayer, and faith. And the higher levels were named for deeper biblical truths. The higher we climbed, the larger both our shields and our swords grew, and fewer of the enemy arrows could reach our positions. Some who had stayed on the lower levels began picking up the enemy arrows and shooting them back. This was a grave mistake. The demons easily dodged the arrows and let them hit Christians. When a Christian was hit by one of these arrows of accusation or slander, a demon of bitterness or rage would fly in and perch on that arrow. He would then begin to urinate and defecate his poison upon that Christian. When a Christian had 2 or 3 of these demons added to the pride or self-righteousness he already had, he was transformed into the contorted image of the demons themselves. We could see this happening from the higher levels, but those on the lower levels who were using the enemy arrows could not see it. About half of us decided to keep climbing, while the other half descended back to the lower levels to explain to those below what was happening. Everyone was then warned to keep climbing and not stop, except for a few who stationed themselves on each level to keep the other soldiers moving higher. Safety at last. When we reached the level called the Unity of the Brethren, none of the enemy arrows could reach us. Many in our camp decided that this was far as they needed to climb. And I understood this because with each new level, the footing was more precarious. However, I also felt much stronger and more skillful with my weapons as I went higher. So I continued to climb. Soon my skills were good enough to shoot and hit the demons without hitting the Christians. I felt that if I kept going higher, I could shoot far enough to hit the main leaders of the enemy horde, who stayed behind their army. I regretted that so many had stopped on the lower levels, where they were safe, but could not hit the enemy. Meanwhile, the strength and character that grew in those who kept climbing made them great champions, each able to destroy many of the enemy. At each level there were arrows of truths scattered about, which I knew were left from those who had fallen from that position. All these arrows were named after truths of a certain level, and from each of the levels many people had fallen. Some of those with me were reluctant to pick up these arrows, but I knew we needed all we could get in order to destroy the great horde below. I picked up one of the arrows, shot it, and so easily hit a demon that the others also started picking up arrows and shooting them. We began to decimate several of the enemy's divisions. Because of this, the entire evil army focused its attention on us. For a time, it seemed that the more we achieved, the more the enemy attacked us. Though our task seemed endless, it had become exhilarating. Since the enemy forces could not hit us with their arrows on the higher levels, swarms of vultures would fly above us to vomit down on us. Other vultures carried demons that would urinate and defecate on the ledges, making them very slippery. Our swords grew after we reached each new level, but I almost left mine behind because I did not see any need for it at the higher levels. I almost casually decided to keep it, thinking that it must have been given to me for some reason. Then, because the ledge I was standing on was so narrow and slippery, I drove the sword into the ground and tied myself to it while I shot at the enemy. The voice of the Lord then came to me, saying, "You have used the wisdom that will enable you to keep climbing. Many have fallen because they did not use their swords properly to anchor themselves.